New revelations about conversations between scientists at the start of a pandemic are now coming to light with the release of new unredacted emails. Also, we talk about the continuing confusion around how to handle the end of the pandemic. Welcome to this Wednesday update where we talk about what people are saying and what people are writing about the most important issues. Now, of course, one of the important issues going on right now is whether the UK is about to see the fall of its Prime Minister, all because of yet another Downing Street drinks party while the country was under strict lockdown. Although such questions are always interesting because of the consequences, the actual circumstances that they had a party when they shouldn't have, not really that interesting. I mean, not to me anyway. There are only so many ways you can say one rule for them and another for us and claim to be gaining any particular insight, although it will justifiably generate outrage. The outcome of all of that will no doubt feature in Friday's news roundup. In the meantime, there are some other important developments where the detail really does matter. New details have emerged this week, for instance, about email correspondence between scientists early in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and how they harboured suspicions that the virus had been engineered from a lab, but also how they agreed that it would be damaging to let such speculation happen publicly and they should try to shut it down. You may recall there were big questions about this when emails to and from Dr. Fauci were released, heavily redacted some months ago, which were suggestive but not conclusive. And particularly a number of scientists seemed open to the invented in a lab theory at one moment, but then there was a meeting between them a few days later, and after that meeting they were authoring a paper that appeared to rule such a thing completely out. And we were told that this was because, in further analysis and discussion, the scientists had reached the conclusion and they simply shared their conclusion with the world. We couldn't see more because of what remained hidden, and institutions that had the emails in their possession had rebuffed efforts to get hold of them. So, for instance, the UK's Telegraph newspaper said that the University of Edinburgh had rejected a freedom of information request that it had made, asking to see some of Professor Rambout's replies to Fauci, saying that disclosure would be likely to endanger the physical or mental health and safety of individuals, which is a neat catch-all excuse for an issue of genuine global concern. But it looks as though maybe the scientists were worried that at a time with Trump as president, when the political temperature was rather high, and the potential for such speculation to damage the reputation of science and, of course, scientists. I certainly had one colleague who dissed me as harbouring conspiracy theories for even entertaining such thoughts. Well, now some of those emails have been secured by Representative James Comer in an unredacted or less redacted form, and it suggests that exactly such considerations were in play. The initial emails were feedback from some of the scientists that had looked at the genetic sequencing of the virus. So the views of Mike Farzan, the discoverer of the SARS receptor, we're told that it included these thoughts and involved the distinction between something engineered by specific human manipulation, which was counted out, versus something that was given accelerated passage in a human cell environment, such as genetically engineered mice. Quote, "The RBD didn't look engineered to him." RBD is receptor binding domain. As in, no human would have selected the individual mutations and cloned them into the RBD, brackets, I think we all agree. Tissue culture passage can often lead to gain of basic sites, including furin cleavage sites, this stuff they have seen with human coronaviruses. He is bothered by the furin site and has a hard time to explain that as an event outside the lab. There are possible ways in nature, but highly unlikely. So, given above, a likely explanation could be something as simple as passage SARS-CoV in tissue culture on human cell lines under BSL-2 for an extended period of time, accidentally creating a virus that would be primed for rapid transmission between humans via gain of furin site from tissue culture and adaptation to human ACE2 receptor via repeated passage. And he finishes with this. So I think it becomes a question of how do you put all this together? Whether you believe in this series of coincidences, what you know of the lab in Wuhan, how much could be in nature, accidental release or natural event. I am 70-30 or 60-40. Then separate feedback from Bob Gary. Before I left the office for the ball, I aligned nCoV with a 96% BAT-CoV sequenced at the Wuhan Institute. Except for the RBD, the S proteins are essentially identical at the amino acid level. Well, all but the perfect insertion of 12 nucleotides that adds the furin site. S2 is over its whole length essentially identical. I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus, or one very similar to it, to nCoV where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides that all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. That, and you don't change any other amino acid in S2? I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. And he went on with his speculation. If you were doing gain-of-function research, you would not use an existing clone of SARS or MERS. These viruses are already human pathogens. What you would do is clone a bat virus that had not yet emerged. Maybe then pass it in human cells for a while to lock in the RBS. Then you reclone and put in the mutations you're interested. One of the first, a polybasic cleavage site. Now, all of that's speculation. It shows that these were valid questions to be raising, despite what was said during the subsequent period. It doesn't prove the speculation was correct, and some of it certainly tended to the opposite view. But what we did then see was the emergence of a worry about how all this speculation would look in the febrile public debate that was then unfolding. So this email from Dr. Francis Collins, for instance. Though the arguments from Ron Fouchier and Christian Drosten are presented with much more forcefulness than necessary, I am coming around to the view that a natural origin is more likely. But I share your view that a swift convening of experts in a confidence-inspiring framework, WHO seems really the only option, is needed, or the voices of conspiracy will quickly dominate, doing great potential harm to science and international harmony. Dr. Ron Fouchier said something similar. An accusation that nCoV 2019 might have been engineered and released into the environment by humans, accidental or intentional, would need to be supported by strong data beyond a reasonable doubt. It is good that this possibility was discussed in detail with a team of experts. However, further debate about such accusations would unnecessarily distract top researchers from their active duties and do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular. On April 16th, Francis Collins was worrying more about the public debate and asked this of Dr. Fauci, wondering if there is something NIH can do to help put down this very destructive conspiracy with what seems to be growing momentum, and he referenced this article in Fox News. I hoped the Nature Medicine article on the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 would settle this, but probably didn't get much visibility. Anything more we can do? ? Again, none of this proves that one theory on the origins was seen as certain over the other. It does prove confirmation that the early paper presented by a number of scientists that were at that meeting, the proximal causes paper, had it in mind that the purpose was to dampen down public debate. That's what a number of us speculated, and we were told that this was being conspiratorial. I was asked, did this mean that I believe that the 2,000 researchers who cited that paper in their own papers, they were all in on a grand conspiracy? And of course the answer is no, and I'd said no such thing. The paper included data on the sequencing of the virus and what was found. The only observation I made was that the brief opinion given in the intro that the virus must necessarily have a natural cause was not supported by the single comment on the topic later in the paper, which was more nuanced. Do we think 2,000 people were citing the paper because they'd separately concluded that the opinion was correct, or were they citing it because of the sequencing data, which was like the actual meat of the paper? Now, Fauci responded to that email, by the way, expressing that he was relatively unconcerned. He said, I would not do anything about this right now. It is a shiny object that will go away in time. Well, it did, but it's back. I say again, the point with these emails isn't that they highlight any specific evidence about the origin of SARS-CoV-2. What they do show, pretty incontrovertibly, is that key Western scientists demonstrated a lack of openness and transparency about a matter of huge, overwhelming public interest. And they were actively trying to shut down discussion of something that at least some of them believed to be a very plausible hypothesis. And this was being done to protect the good name of science and international relations with China. The virus may or may not turn out to have been leaked from a lab. I rather fear we'll never really know the truth on that one. But what seems certain is that a major breach of public duty by those scientists way more likely to achieve the damage that they actually feared and that motivated them. Discussing a valid hypothesis in public, even though some genuine conspiracists would take it and run with it, is nothing compared to being seen to cover something up. If you want to give meat and drink to conspiracists, that's it, right there. This should also be seen in the context of the revelation last month from the US Right to Know website that one of the other early papers decrying suggestions of a lab origin turned out to have suggested edits by Shi Zhengli, the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, possibly one of the most remarkable conflicts of interest you could get and not openly disclosed in any way. One of the 3 suggested edits she put forward was to delete a paragraph discussing the mouse-adapted SARS-CoV virus MA15, a virus created via exactly the sort of serial passage gain-of-function process speculated on by the scientists in these newly unredacted emails. More to come on all of this, surely. Meanwhile, of course, here we are 2 years later, still dealing with the pandemic, wherever it came from. I said in Friday's news roundup that I thought we'd reached the point in the slow end of the pandemic where people milling around in confusion, somewhat trying to understand when and how to change their fixed positions of the last couple of years. Because we've had 2 solid tribes for the best part of 2 years, the COVID cautious, who support all the lockdowns and all the measures and worry deeply about the impacts of SARS-CoV-2, and then the COVID skeptics, branded as COVIDiots by the other side, who focus on the costs of lockdowns and whether it's really no worse than the flu and so on and so on. Neither side has a sterling track record of sticking to the data. Both have had some interesting things to say nevertheless, so long as you keep away from the absolute fringes where madness lies. But now we're seeing the COVID cautious group split again into 2 camps, largely by Omicron, as well as the simple fact, repeated often here, that once you've got as many people fully vaccinated as you're going to get, and you have new treatment drugs coming online as well, eventually you have to ask yourself what else you're waiting for before you go back to some degree of normality. But also that has been escalated because Omicron is so infectious that so many of the people who sheltered and masked and were highly cautious, and often while being morally censorious of those who caught it because it had become a moral thing, well, they've also been catching it. So whereas before they could hold to the view that if you've done all the right things, if you've followed the science and therefore you've stayed free from COVID, but those COVIDiots, they do the wrong thing and so they catch it. Well, they can't hold to that anymore because everybody is catching Omicron and everyone's going to at some point, it seems. So we're now starting to see this work through and emerge into the mainstream discourse. There was this article in The Atlantic, for instance. Why more Americans are saying that they're vaxxed and done. The attitudes of the vaxxed and dones, or the VADs, is this, according to the article. For more than a year, I did everything that public health authorities told me to. I wore masks, I cancelled vacations, I made sacrifices, I got vaccinated, I got boosted, I'm happy to get boosted again, but this virus doesn't stop. Year over year, the infections don't decrease. Instead, virulence for people like me is decreasing, either because the virus is changing or because of growing population immunity, or both. Americans should stop pointlessly guilting themselves about all these cases. As the coronavirus continues its unstoppable march towards endemicity, our attitude towards the virus should follow a similar path towards stoicism. So I'm prepared to treat this like I've treated the flu, by basically not worrying about it and living my life normally. Sooner or later, that is the transition that you expect, unless you're still holding out hope for zero COVID, and good luck with that. Then the question really is when you reach that point, when you think we should all reach that point, not if. Until then, of course, the COVID cautious remain fixed in the view that they've had, rightly or wrongly, for 2 years. Again, the Atlantic article describes their position. Why on earth would we suddenly relax measures now, during the largest statistical wave of COVID ever recorded in the US? We shouldn't treat Omicron like any old seasonal flu, because it's not like any old seasonal flu. It's likely deadlier for those without immunity, and almost certainly several times more transmissible for everybody else. We have no idea what the effects of Omicron on long COVID will be, but evidence of lingering symptoms should make us wary of just letting tens of millions of people get needlessly infected. Moreover, the healthcare system is already worn down and at risk of being overloaded. These people, for the best of intentions, will hold to the faith that restricting society to contain the virus is still self-evidently the right thing to do, even though the evidence now seems to be that with Omicron, none of your measures are going to make any difference to its spread anyway. And we've seen that in the UK, with both Scotland and Wales contrasted with England. More relaxed policy in England, stricter in Scotland, and even stricter than that in Wales. Lower case rates in England, higher in Scotland and Wales, and the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, is a prime example of those that are steadfastly refusing to accept the implications of the data, holding instead to what intuitively feels right. So he accused Boris Johnson of failing to protect the people of England because he wasn't following his example on stricter measures. He called England the outlier when it comes to COVID. He said those calling for COVID restrictions to be eased were factually wrong. The truth is that epidemiologists and others are divided, somewhat belying the certainty of his stance. So those such as Professor John Watkins at Cardiff University are saying that measures there should be relaxed given how Omicron is playing out. But then you had the Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, saying that it opposes relaxation at this point. Mind you, even if you conclude that the time has indeed come to learn to live with COVID, not everyone quite agrees that such a concept means a return to what we would consider to be normality. So First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, for instance, suggested that Scots might be forced to continue wearing face masks for years to come as part of living with COVID. Like Mark Drakeford, she too insisted that Scotland's more restrictive policies had worked, in spite of the significantly higher spread we've seen there than we have seen in England. And this came down to the totally unverifiable claim: it would have been worse if we hadn't done it. If Scotland hadn't been in part lockdown for Christmas, we would be in an even more challenging situation right now. Really, honestly, it doesn't matter. As England moves towards normality, it will be politically completely untenable for Scotland to hold on to mask mandates all on its own. Those words will end up being conveniently forgotten when the time is right. Meanwhile, the experts continue to have a really poor end to the pandemic, with this argument over whether people should be allowed to isolate only for 5 days if they catch Omicron and then get a negative test at the end of that period, rather than 7 days. The UK Health Security Agency has admitted that it made a mistake when it claimed that England's isolation rules were in line with those in the US, which it had done in arguing that it should be kept at 7 days. This argument was apparently made repeatedly in batting back calls in the cabinet for a reduction to provide some relief to workplaces and systems that have been struggling from staff absences. It said that the 5-day isolation period in the US began later than the UK's did, so it was not comparing like with like to say the UK should go to 5 days. Now, if you're getting expert advice, the whole point of them being from, experts is that they're supposed to get those sorts of details right. Otherwise, you might as well get your scientific advice from Boris Johnson or even Piers Corbyn. But they were wrong. Both countries start the clock on isolation from the point that symptoms appear. So once again, the government's left looking incompetent. And not for the first time, it's because of the nature and the quality of the advice they're getting from experts, not because just of their verifiable incompetence. And of course, their love of partying separately. If there's anyone who can actually walk in a straight line without falling over, there's a great career waiting for you at the heart of government. If you can, put up with all the nonsense. And of course, it's the presence of all the nonsense that tends to keep the good people away, precisely to avoid it. Something that matters rather when grown-up decisions are required. Alright, that's all I've got today. See you on Friday for the weekly news roundup. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think will also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.